Ladies and gentlemen, I hope everybody is here already. I welcome you all to start the last session of this year's Aboagora. And I have the particular pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mia Consalvo. She's a leading specialist in game studies. She earned her PhD at the University of Iowa, I think. She has worked in several universities, in MIT, in the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and today he works at the Concordia University in Montreal, where she is research chair of gaming and design, or game studies and design. Yeah. Sorry. She's the author of Cheating, Gaining Advantage of Video Games, and the author of many, many key articles in the field of game studies. And today, her title is Avatars, Players, Platforms, and Participation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. And I am well aware that I stand between you and the drinks at the reception. So I will be brief. Actually, this talk shouldn't take too long so that we have lots of time at the end for questions and discussion. And before I move into the content of this talk, I should plug my latest book, which just came out, Sports Video Games. It's an edited volume. Everything you want to know about the players, the games, and the industry and the developers of sports video games. I have flyers if you want one for a discount. But this material is actually from a different book, one that I've been co-writing with Jason Beggy, a PhD student with me at Concordia, and we actually just shipped it off to the publishers last Friday. So that was very exciting. So this is very, very fresh material. And in the description of the talk, I think I had mentioned a few things. I hope to touch on as many as possible here, but if there's something in particular I don't mention, feel free to ask me a question later. And if you need to sneak out early, this is kind of where the entire talk is going. Okay, so these are the big conclusions. I don't like, these grand reveals at the end. So, to kind of quickly sum up in advance, the human-avatar relationship that lots of game studies scholars think about and write about, it's complicated. It's not an easy one-to-one relationship that it often gets boiled down to. I am the avatar is me. And I will go through how we came to think about this and why shortly. Second, the platforms that games are played on are very important and have interesting effects on how we approach games, how they construct certain audiences for games, and then how different player communities might clash as a result of different platforms coming together. And then finally, participation, playing, play styles, play frequency, player types. These things are a lot more fluid, are more changeable than maybe early research has suggested. Okay, so those are kind of the three key takeaways. To kind of link this also back to a little bit of what the themes have been the last few days, I think that I wasn't really thinking about this as much as the human-machine relationship as maybe the human-digital relationship. And certainly a lot of what I'm interested in is how people, their relationships are mediated through machines and through the digital, sort of related to the internet community's panel discussion yesterday, but also how the machines themselves, the digital, the code, its affordances and constraints impact players themselves, how they think about their relationship maybe with a game, and how they approach it. So to give you a little bit of context, this study is of one particular game called Faunasphere that was created by Big Fish Games. Big Fish Games is mostly known for being a casual game company. They have a portal on the web. They do like at least one game every day. Most of the games that they create are hidden object games. And if you've never played them, sort of imagine a static screen with all kinds of stuff thrown up on the screen, and it's a little bit like a Where's Waldo. So you have like a list of things that you need to find through all the clutter, and you're finding things that might help you solve a mystery. And that was really how they made their money. They developed some of these games, but they also published them, and that was their dominant business model. Until they decided to experiment and create a casual MMO called Faunasphere. And first I should ask, has anyone here ever played Faunasphere? You will note that nobody has raised their hand, okay? And this is pretty much the reaction I get whenever I ask that question. Let me just show you, this is a short video. It was the launch video that the company created for the game. Okay. I love that hatch eggs. You know, that this is the big deal in the game. Okay, so I mentioned this is a casual MMO, and if you're unfamiliar with what that term means, most MMOs are massively multiplayer online games. People think of something like World of Warcraft, where there's a fantasy theme, there are orcs and elves, you're killing monsters, usually ogres or that type of thing, and you have a sword and you run around in this world with other people and you gain points and level up and you get better stuff so that you can kill harder monsters and rinse and repeat. And there was, at one point in time, there's still a little bit of this going on now, a sense that, well, maybe we can appeal to different types of players with these sort of persistent online worlds. And something a little different from like Second Life, where there's really no goal to Second Life. You can kind of go in and build stuff and do whatever you want, but a little bit more game-like. So there is some goal, objective, you've got characters, and those types of things. And this would be designed in sort of this casual sense in a few different ways. It might appeal to people who played casual games, like the type I mentioned that Big Fish usually courted. And also, it could be played casually in that, you could play for short periods of time and still make progress. And actually, people have talked about World of Warcraft as being able to be played casually as well. So the game itself, that's its entire lifespan that you see right there. It lasted just a little bit over 2 years. And as I mentioned, the company that made it was initially thinking of the audience that it already had for casual games as sort of the natural audience, because these were largely older women. They were spending a lot of money on these downloadable games, and they thought maybe this would be something appealing to them. They created it as a browser-based game. It was Flash-based, so you could run it on the web on any PC or Mac. And it was a freemium-type game, which means that anybody could open an account. You would get 3 fauna. You could play for free. But then there were paid accounts where you could have more fauna, get a special currency within the game. And you were called a caretaker. So this is as dark and evil as the game ever looked. You would be the little creature you can see right there, and your job in the game partly is you don't kill anything, you zap pollution. And so you've got that little collar there, and you can see a little green, like sort of lightning shooting out. That's a big pile of pollution that you're zapping to kill, and that's actually Monty, the pollution monster. Monty does not exist normally in the world of Faunasphere. It's a bright and colorful game, which you'll see shortly. This is an instance, the one kind of big instance in the game that you have to kill him as part of a goal. And it was a good way to get XP in the game. But really what was sort of driving a lot of the interest, remember that hatch eggs, that was sort of the key thing, is that you would raise these fauna. When they leveled up, what they did was they laid an egg. and this egg went into your inventory, and you would trade eggs with other players, or you could buy and sell them. And the idea was that you were sort of cross-pollinating, cross-breeding different fauna. And so, like, certainly you could have a fauna, it would lay an egg, and you could hatch it in your den, but you would probably get, like, exactly the same type of fauna. Whereas if you were trading with different people, you might get a fauna, as you can see here, with, like, a different color that was like a monkey or a cat, or a different type of tail, or occasionally, this was like the way that Big Fish did it, sometimes you would hatch an egg and an entirely new type of fauna would appear. Okay, and then some of them had very rare sort of elements. And so there was this economy in eggs, and that was like a big part of the game. So kind of coming into this study, I was contacted by the folks at Big Fish. They had read a piece I had done on one of their earlier casual games, and they were interested in research, and they said, we've got this game, we're just launching, we're kind of curious about how our players are responding to it. Would you be interested in working with us? And I said, sure. And we, at first, we had these grand visions of them giving us all kinds of data and, backstage access and all of these wonderful things. And of course, that didn't quite work out. But what they did do was we created a survey, and they agreed to promote it, and they published it in their monthly newsletter to their players, and so we got quite a bit of responses. This was the first phase of the study, and this is important to keep in mind. So for this first wave, as you can see, we got quite a few responses, which was pretty good. We also, as I mentioned, we got a little bit of usage data. One drawback is we never got a real number of how many total players were in the game. This was something we could never find out to sort of compare against, what we were, the responses that we were getting, or our best estimates. We did do an interview with the community manager, and we were actively studying the forums. We played the game. We didn't really do active ethnography within the game, but we were really sort of just getting a sense of how the game worked. And so that was the initial data draw. And as you can see here, players were coming from pretty much all over, although predominantly from North America. So for this slice of the data, this was an MMO that was largely female, 93%, and largely adult. You can see here the skews for the ages. And so it was really sort of mimicking that audience for casual games that Big Fish was initially drawing from. Pretty well educated. And this was also a crowd that was fairly new to MMOs. We did find some people who also played World of Warcraft, were experienced with Second Life, played Age of Conan, more traditional type games. I think it was like 5 or 8% said they didn't know what an MMO was, but the vast majority, didn't have any prior experience. They were coming into this quite new. However, they were not very casual in how they played this game. So, as you can see here, 41% said they played several times a day, 37% every day, 14% several times a week. And then you can see here, per session, half said they played for more than 2 hours at a time. If you go through and you add up these numbers, these sort of echo what you find for hardcore MMO, EverQuest, WoW, EVE Online types of players. Okay. Now, I mentioned that Big Fish did give us a little bit of back-end data. They had told us the average play session was, I think it was something like 37 minutes. It's in the book, I can look it up later. But that was not what our players had said. Now, either players were vastly, overestimating. What we think is happening is, this wasn't a totally random survey, right? These were people who opted in, they were very interested, they were very passionate. Either they really loved the game, a few really hated the game, or really wanted to make changes to it. So, this is something that most people in game studies are going to have a problem with. The people that choose to respond to you are generally the ones that are more interested in. But I just think that that's important to point out. And this is also key. We sort of went in thinking, there's been a lot of research in player types, how do people approach games? There are Bartles sort of achievers, explorers, killers, socializers, but then there's also been work on, do women and men play differently? And sort of in the back of our heads, we were thinking, is it really that women just want to be social? That was sort of one of the predominant early findings. And so we had listed a bunch of activities, in this survey about what do you enjoy most as part of the game, and asked people to rank order them. And this was the order. So number 1 was completing goals. These are kind of quests within the game, find so many of this, or dig up these parts or put them together to get X prize or X reward or something. The second was breeding fauna. Not too surprising, it's a major part of the game. Third was leveling them up. You remember leveling up was when you laid the egg so that you could breed more fauna, kind of tightly linked in there. Within the game, there were the public spaces that everybody could be a part of, but then you also had your private space that you could decorate any way that you wanted. It was sort of your home sphere. And you could collect different items, you could win certain items, you could purchase very rare items, there were holiday items, so you could set them up how you wanted them. And all of your fauna could exist sort of in your home sphere. It was like a mini menagerie. And everybody had a little portal so that people could visit your home sphere, and you would give friends an invitation to your sphere so that they could access it. So that was pretty popular. But then interestingly, the only sort of social one to crack the top 5, interacting with friends, it was at number 5, which we thought, okay, so at least for these women, social was interesting and important, but not as important maybe as some of these other elements of the game. So it challenged some of what we had been finding in game studies research. Okay, so remember that data. That was the first slice. This happened shortly, we had gathered this data shortly after the game had left beta, it had gone into public launch. And so, it had just opened, people were optimistic, people were actively playing the game. Now I want to back up just a little bit. We actually did a second data collection shortly after that, a few months after that, where we started to do interviews with players. And also as part of the survey, we had some open-ended questions as well. And one of the things that we were curious about was the beta period. And if you're familiar with virtual worlds and MMOs, and actually even most social network games now, these games have these periods before they're sort of publicly launched. And there's usually like an alpha where the game can go, up and down at a moment's notice and things are wiped out and then new things appear. And then there's a closed beta with, just a very small group of selected invitees to play the game. Maybe a more open beta. And this is where, the developers are still kind of testing things. They're working out bugs and known issues. They're gradually, inviting more people to play for free so that they can test the server loads. And they're also asking players to sort of report back on, what do you find enjoyable? What's troublesome? Where are the issues? That kind of thing. And there's really been nobody sort of looking at beta periods in terms of how they shape player communities within these games, which we find kind of curious because it seemed that with Faunasphere, this was a really critical period. Obviously it was critical for the developers, and their future financial success in the game, but for the players themselves and the ultimate community that emerged, beta was this really, really important period. And it was interesting and unique in some different ways, like maybe compared to more traditional MMOs. So for example, I mentioned that a lot of those players were brand new to MMOs. These were not people who had lots of time playing, as elves and warlocks and were familiar with mage classes and XP and bonuses and resting periods and all that kind of thing. And so they were really just sort of excited about this game, and they were also critically mostly Big Fish Games customers already. They had gathered on the forums there from Big Fish, and they were talking about the game and how to play it. And when we looked at the forums, and when we talked to people about the beta period, what emerged was sort of this sense that they were all in this together, that they were very excited about the game, and that they really wanted to help each other. There was this culture of niceness that sort of emerged. And they really, really were very intent that, they were taking this role as beta players seriously. And so they saw, some of them said this was the best time because I felt special, that people were listening to me. And it wasn't just other players, but it was the company itself. They were saying, here's this bug, here's that bug, you need more content here. And interestingly, these players quickly sort of became experts. They worked together to build knowledge, which they could then take into the open launch, and they decided, this is how we're going to play the game. They actually created, I forget what it was called exactly. I think it was like this pledge of niceness. It was a forum thread, and there was a sort of a long text about how I will help others, I will kind of pay it forward, and people would sign this pledge within the forums. And this was the tone that they wanted to set for the space. Now compare this, for example, with something like EVE Online, where if you go into that game, you kind of know and expect, and if you don't, it's maybe a rude surprise, that you are going to be shot down, attacked, probably within your first several hours of play. So these players instead were sort of saying, this is how we expect the community to behave. Zapping, which I mentioned, you zap pollution. In this game, you sort of click where you want your fauna to go, and then you click on the pollution to zap it. Because of the way that the view of the screen is, sometimes if there's like a big pile of pollution, you might not see if there's somebody on the other side already zapping. And zapping somebody else's pollution, according to the players, was a big no-no. Okay? This was rude behavior. This is sort of the equivalent of ninja looting in Faunasphere. And so players would sort of hop all around, sort of make sure that there was nobody around so that, they weren't stealing anybody's pollution. Another thing that they sort of decided was, it was perfectly acceptable to trade eggs and to ask, but you had to ask nicely. Please and thank you were very important words in this community. And so because they were doing this, they were already fairly tight-knit. They had come from this prior game community, Big Fish. They were fairly homogenous, in terms of their demographics. They didn't have that prior MMO experience to sort of work against. They felt fairly confident in this is how we're going to play the game, here's what we're going to do, and they really developed this strong sense of ownership. Interestingly, a few of them reported to us saying, we were actually really nervous when the game launched because we had told the company we didn't think that there was enough content yet and that the game might not succeed. Remember, these are people who are largely new to MMOs. They already felt like they were experts and that their opinions mattered. Okay? Of course, every time that you have a close-knit community, that means that there are people who are not part of the community. And, inevitably tensions will emerge. And this became evident when the game went into public launch and suddenly, the floodgates opened, more people showed up. At first, a lot of them were also Big Fish Games customers, and so they had some of the same values and interests, but also there were people from the web who may not have had, that background. And suddenly the space was more crowded. And people started to feel like, I don't know if these are kind of my people or not. And there was sort of this split or, worry going on, and some of the new players felt like the older players were this clique, and they didn't, they just had these arbitrary rules for doing things, and the older players said, well, these new players, they don't know how to play the game, and they won't read any of our etiquette guides, and who do they think they are? And so I'll get into that in a moment because it really sort of blew up when the game launched on Facebook. Now remember, the game first launched just on the web, and it continued like that for a few months. But just to sort of reiterate here, the importance of the temporal context of a game is really important. And this is going to come into play later on too. But how the game, how people think about a game, it really matters when in the game that it is. Is it a beta period? Is it an alpha period? Is it the last day of the game? how players situate themselves, how they're thinking about it, how the game is being promoted, those all have important implications, I think, for how we think about these things. Okay, so we go from beta to the web launch, and actually the web launch, just like less than 6 months later, Big Fish put the game onto Facebook. And here's where things kind of really sort of got interesting. So suddenly, you had a whole bunch of new players flooding into the game, and a whole bunch of unhappy veteran players. And what we think was going on were a few different things. So this is actually from Cityville. I think that's not Farmville right there. But players, the originals, we'll call them the veteran players, they really sort of reacted unhappily. They felt that these new group of players didn't know how to play the game, by which they meant they didn't know the expected rules, the etiquette for how they felt the game should be played. And that was due to a couple of different reasons. The first one, I think, is a differing expectation for how games should be played. So they had set up this sort of rule set for how Faunosphere should be played. However, in going over to Facebook, they were confronted with an entirely different rule set for how games are played. So how many of you have played Farmville, Cityville, Castleville, any of a Ville game? Small group. Okay. So in these games, if you know anybody who plays them, you know that part of the job is begging your friends for stuff, right? Anything you need to build in the game, you're either going to grow a carrot and you have to wait for the carrot to ripen and get ready and pick it, but maybe you need a special hammer to build the fence so that you can keep the skunks away from your carrots, and you've got to ask your friends for hammers, or you've got to ask your friends for something to finish a quest. You've got to ask your friends for just about everything. And Zynga, is the early popularizer of these types of games. They had sort of structured and formalized this model, and this happened shortly before Faunosphere showed up, such that people who played a lot of social network games developed sort of just a sense of like, this is how you play games on Facebook. You just sort of have this utilitarian approach. I need stuff. I'm just going to send Susanna a request for ribbon, and Susanna's going to send it to me, and then because she knows that if she needs something, I'll send it to her later. And so it really wasn't like this culture of niceness. It wasn't a please and thank you type of atmosphere. It was really just, I need this. Hey, Alice, can I have this? Yeah, okay, thanks. Here's that kind of thing. And so that sort of butted heads against the Faunosphere community. Likewise, social network games, lots of people play in short bursts because you only have so much energy before your energy is depleted. So you're not spending a lot of time in the game. There's a lot of turnover in these games, so people are constantly coming and going. And also, the avatars are often meaningless in terms of play. So remember, in Faunosphere, you're hatching these fauna, you're raising them, you're taking care of them, versus, think about if you did play one of those build and harvest games, what did your avatar look like? Most people have no clue. Sometimes even it's just your little profile picture, right? It really means nothing. So this resulted in what we called platform anxiety. And this is what players were telling us in terms of how they felt that Facebook changed Faunosphere. So rudeness, it didn't really happen much until Facebook entered. That was the downfall of the game. Many caretakers were resentful that players with Facebook connections who played from Facebook got free items. Paying players resented this. Remember I said that gifting was really important in Facebook games? And to sort of match kind of the look and feel of Facebook, when Big Fish launched the game there, they created some Facebook exclusive items. Now remember, you could still log into this game via the web. You did not have to use Facebook if you didn't want to. And some players really didn't want to. They didn't like Facebook. They didn't like the privacy issues associated with it. They didn't want the account. They weren't sure how to set one up. They just really didn't want to be there. But then they found out that there were special gifts only available to people who used it via Facebook, which really pissed off some people. and especially paying customers. They said, I'm paying like $10 a month for this game, and there's things that even free players who are just on Facebook get that I don't. So these tensions started to grow. And as I mentioned, you have these different types of groups of players confronting one another in the game, creating these clash of expectations. So you have veteran players saying, whenever you went out into the main world, from their private space into the central game space, these demands for items, they were just coming at you. People would wait by the gates to accost you. And, you could type in public chat, or people would get sent private messages, that just said, give me an egg, I want bucks, give me money. People were just that was like the expectation that you just asked for stuff and people gave it to you. And remember, these are people who are used to saying please and thank you and looking around before, zapping the pollution. And they just said, it was overwhelming and we couldn't deal with it. And, another player said, I never saw one incident of rudeness or the gimme I want brigade until after the Facebook launch. And these are the tamer comments that I'm putting up here. Now, of course, there were some people who said, oh, I never saw, it was bad before. There were always bad players. But there was really a sense among some players that Facebook really changed things. And again, people said the Facebook crowd is different. Those games demand begging. Some people did see that it was a difference in the design of the game that was changing how people behaved. And some people said a whole generation of players entered who were used to traditional Facebook games. So, some people sort of worked through why some people were behaving differently in the game. Some people didn't, but the end result was still the same. They were unhappy with this new style of play and, these new types of players. So I mentioned that there were two reasons that, tensions emerged. So that was one, sort of this different style of game, different style of play. And the other one was kids. When we asked people, what do you think of new players of the game, pretty much everybody made the leap from new players to Facebook players to children. And rude children, begging children, hordes of children, evil children. And we're like, okay, tell us about these kids. And again, these are sort of some of the tamer comments, but what was really interesting, in addition to just sort of how these players sort of broke a lot of stereotypes, we were thinking, you might think older adult women, they wouldn't mind children around. Oh no, they really didn't want children around. They said, this is our space, okay? Big Fish, when they set up this game, they said it was for adults. And this is, as you can see here, I've spent my adult life involved with my kids, I put in my time. This is my time to be around adults. And this is what I thought I was going to find. And this was a comment that was repeated again and again. There were some people who said, I enjoy playing with my children, but for a lot more, it was really sort of this space that was important to them apart from their daily life and apart from those normal routines. And it sort of echoes, if you know Janice Radway's Reading the Romance back from the 80s. She had looked at women who read romance novels and said, why do you read them? What do you get from them? And what was interesting that she found was, even if these were books that were, very sexist, very patriarchal, kind of disturbing themes, that the women were sort of doing this interesting thing and claiming a time and a space for themselves. And so, there was this kind of mixed thing going on, but that she felt that was important to point out. And that was also kind of the sense that we got with this game for these women, that this was their space, that this was their time. And so that was something they really resented, children around in that space. And they really felt like, Facebook had introduced this group. And so, going back again to this idea of the platform, we feel like, platforms are really important to think about. Mostly we've looked at them in terms of technology and, and how technology shapes things, like how on the Atari, there are certain text specifications for the type of game that you could create. But now we have many social platforms and software platforms, and those bring with them certain demographic groups, certain expectations for use. It was also really important or significant that Zynga had showed up, and established Farmville as this really dominant model before Faunasphere came along. If Zynga had not been there, maybe that type of player would not have emerged. But then again, that popularity of a game like Farmville is probably what drew a company like Big Fish Games to think, there are at the time 500 million Facebook accounts. Look at all those potential players of our game. And so, those are interesting and important things to think about, the platform that the game is on. So, the game went through beta, the game launched on the web, it went to Facebook, and then it went away. So, not long after that, the players of the game were sent an email, and a note went up on the central message boards, February 15th, 2011, that the game was going to be phased out. The company said, you have a month before we shut down the game. It will close on March 15th. And everything like recent purchases will be refunded. We're not going to charge money from now until the end. Basically, you have 30 days, get your affairs in order. And so how did the players react? Well, not well. It's probably too small to read. But on the forums, they instantly responded, this person saying, I'll be missing all my friends from around the world. Somebody else says, this is where I met all my best friends, and I've had the greatest journey here. Faunasphere changed my life. I'd do anything to keep it. Like everyone else, I'm very sad to see this game end. I've cried real tears over the news. I've never experienced a game like this before. Interestingly, you see a little bit of return of the social. Suddenly, people are afraid that, they're not going to have the space to meet with their friends. Some people were a little more angry and a little less eloquent. What, are you kidding me? Phased out to nothing, nothing at all. I'm shocked, saddened, and pissed off. I can't tell you how much in disbelief this leaves me. On and on and on. Players were not going to go quietly. And so we decided, again, another good data gathering opportunity for game studies researchers. We have the ability to see how a game ends, how players react to it, what's going on. Many virtual worlds, even older than this, are still going. Final Fantasy XI online game, which was launched in 2002, is still going. The original EverQuest is still going. I think Ultima Online is still online. World of Warcraft, that will be an interesting game to study if it ever closes. We know very little about what happens at the end of these virtual worlds. There have been some that have gone sort of out, but there have just been like a few journalistic accounts. So we decided that we were going to investigate it, and we spent time in the game again. We studied the forums, we talked with the players. And we found some really interesting things emerging. So remember going back to that initial survey and what do you like to do within the game? What are your favorite activities and how much do you play? Well, suddenly people were changing their story. Some people were so upset by the closure of the game that they said, I can't play anymore. It's over for me. I just, I logged out that day and it was done. Somebody else said, I was so upset, I was crying, and it took me 2 weeks before I could log back in and play. Like I would go to the login screen, tears would start to fall, and but finally, I was able to sort of get back in. So some people just sort of disengaged entirely. Other people said, I was just, in the game every day. I suddenly was playing around the clock, or I was putting in all these hours. Some people who said, well, I enjoyed the game, I decorated my sphere and I like to hatch things. One person said to us, I made a promise to my fauna to get them up to level 20. She had 3 fauna that she made a promise to, because at level 20, that was the maximum level, they got a gold collar. And so she was essentially grinding within the game, all right? And so, these are things that, if you think about how we conceptualize player types, those are very static, achiever, explorer. These people were totally messing with these models because they were totally changing their play style and their interests because of this impending closure. Likewise, people were starting to prepare for the end, so they were also doing some other things as well. Some of them were also really, really mad, as I mentioned before. Part of that was due to how the developers interacted with them. or chose not to. Because after the initial announcements, there was almost no communication from the company, which really sort of upset a lot of players. So the day of the sunset, that's what it's called in the industry when the game closes or ends. Nice term, isn't it? Sunset. So we were in the game, we were walking around digitally, and we found, a fair amount of players. We had sort of expected, before going in, we thought, we bet there will be a lot of players around, a lot of fauna. And because this is the end, maybe they'll be doing things, talking with one another, getting together, building for this final thing. And, nobody knows what's really going to happen. Maybe there'll be some event, for the last hour or so. We encountered some players. Somebody mentioned that they were on these little memory walks. Lots of people said that they were there taking screenshots of the different areas. Many people said that they were visiting with their fauna. And we gathered, there's a central space within the game called Rock Garden, and that's where we sort of ended up towards the end. We thought, this is sort of like the main public area. Certainly this will be where lots of people will be, where lots of players will be. And there was a fair amount, but there weren't quite as many as we thought there should be. And as the minutes ticked on, people were sort of you could change fauna at a moment's notice. They were pulling out one fauna after another to sort of show off all their different fauna. They were doing tricks with their fauna, but some of them were also disappearing. And we thought, where are they going? Don't they want to be here for the very end? And what we later found out, and I'll go into more shortly, is that they were leaving the public space to be in their private space because they wanted to be with their fauna, with their own fauna, rather than with players within the game. So the game ended. There was no big reveal, no spaceship came down and took the fauna away or anything like that. Or like with the Matrix Online, there's supposed to be, a machine crushing them. Nothing happened, just this message appeared, sorry, can't connect to the server. It wasn't even like the end, right? It's just like a network connection error, and people were like, oh, really? Gosh, that's kind of cheesy. And then when you went to the website for Faunasphere, this was the image that appeared. You restored our world. You came, you adopted, you zapped, you put tremendous effort into caring for these creatures. Thanks to your commitment as a caretaker, the fauna now have a clean world to call home. Okay? So remember that fiction of the pollution that you're zapping. Apparently, even though real pollution in the world respawned constantly, I guess at the end it just all disappeared. So now the fauna are all happy and living in this pollution-free world. And critically for us, at the same time that the world ended, the forums disappeared. These were heavily moderated forums, but we had archived a little bit of it, but not enough. So just as a tip, if you do this type of research, archive your forums, because they were gone. And that was kind of a rude surprise. So I mentioned these people who were disappearing from the public space to go into their private space to be with their fauna. And this is where things got interesting again. And I mentioned way at the beginning this player-avatar relationship being more complicated. Now remember, in this game, players are constructed as caretakers. You are not your fauna. You take care of fauna. You can have, remember the free account, 3 fauna. Paid accounts, it was, I think, up to 30 fauna that could exist in your private sphere. And remember also that part of the fun of the game is cross-breeding fauna to get new and different types. And so if you're really interested in that type of thing, you want as many fauna as possible. And so the game really encouraged you not to identify, maybe you had a favorite or two, but not to identify you as your avatar, as your fauna, but that these were sort of, they're cute animals, they're sort of pets. They're almost like, the little Tamagotchis. And so when we asked people, what were you doing at the end of the world, these are the things that they said. I spent time with my fauna. I had them do their tricks. This one is really key. During the last 5 minutes, I started throwing all my food from inventory on the ground. Did not want anyone to starve, lol, and I cried. Fauna in this game can't die. Okay, like Tamagotchi could actually die. Remember those little things, like if you didn't constantly feed them? But fauna could exist sort of in stasis forever. If you went around zapping lots of things with your fauna, they might get very tired and unhappy, and the worst that would happen is they would fall asleep. And then they would go back to the sphere and sleep it off, and then they'd be okay again. So they didn't really need to eat. But people said these kinds of things to us again and again, towards the end. I really wanted to make sure they were okay. And, this person admits, like if you look at the lull, they know that this is silly, right? They're saying, I know that this is a virtual creature, that they are not really starving, that this is not a real pet or animal, but nonetheless, I cried. I still felt some attachment. And players, when they were more reflective, said to us things like, your fauna weren't just a bunch of pixels, they were your kids. You gave birth to them, you fed them, you cared for them, you taught them things. That was the relationship that the game was really encouraging players to take. This person said it was heartbreaking, like when you have to put a pet to sleep. And then somebody else said, look at the premise of the game. It's about these naming and raising pets. In the real world, a good person wouldn't just, adopt a pet, take care of it, and then walk away. They wouldn't abandon their pet. And that's what the game made us do. And so these players were really, this was what they were most upset about. It wasn't those social connections, because they had actually already created a Facebook group where they met immediately after the game closed. What they were most upset about was the fauna, because they couldn't take the fauna with them, anywhere. So then the question becomes, how much do we really identify with our avatars? And what I think is that there are certainly times when there are one-to-one connections between people and avatars, but that those situations have sort of started to slip and encompass all of our relationships with all of our avatars. And that's really not what's going on. We have to think about much more specific cases, that things are quite different and more complex than those easy theoretical bases would suggest. And a lot of this, goes back to Sherry Turkle and her work, Life on the Screen, and her early studies of players of Muds and Moos, and looking at how people used, avatars in these worlds to kind of work through personality, psychological issues, and that kind of thing. And that's become a lot of shorthand for how we think about how we identify with avatars. But instead, what we see going on, at least in this game, is a fiction that was really important, this caretaker, that really pushed you not to think of yourself as the avatar, that this was some kind of virtual pet. You were a caregiver. And that didn't mean that you weren't invested in that virtual character. Far from it. These people probably felt worse because they couldn't take those virtual pets with them. People have very different relationships with animals, with pets, than they may have with other people. And so it doesn't mean just because I am not my avatar that I don't care about it. But we really need to think through more carefully, how we're theorizing these relationships. These are just fun screenshots, because you're probably getting tired. Some of the people who left Faunasphere went into Glitch, another casual MMO, and they created these sort of little mashup screenshots. Woe to them, Glitch also closed about a year later. That was another screenshot of Glitch. That's my dog. So people don't always identify with their avatars, just recapping here. But avatars, maybe we can see them as, this sort of boundary objects. Sometimes they are representative of yourself or an aspect of yourself. They may enable actions or prevent others. Sometimes they may simply be tools for people. Not everybody has this strong relationship. It's just, this is something to get you from point A to point B, to level up, to do certain things. But we need to sort of, broaden our thinking in terms of what we consider avatars or player characters. And so finally, to sum up, we learned a few things going through this project. And one of them that's not here really is the importance of studying kind of the edge cases. When I first started studying video games, I felt like I came out of media studies and people were studying television and film, and I felt like I was kind of, off in the distance, like, I study video games. I was sort of off by myself. And then I found myself in the middle of video game studies, and I guess I sort of backed up again, and people who were studying World of Warcraft, I'm like, I'm studying Faunasphere. And nobody studies faunosphere. Jason and I think we were the only two academics to ever study faunosphere, and now that it's closed, we win. But because this game was so different, it really challenges a lot of how we think about how players play, what their interests are. Going back to this idea of player types and player typologies, some of these typologies are so imbricated in these fantasy themes that they just ask questions about how do you collect your swords, or do you like to level up by doing this or that, and it's all tied to the fiction. Once you change the fiction, you can have an entirely different world, and you might have entirely different ways that players relate to them. It'll change how players relate to the game, to the avatars. As you can see here, if you're fortunate enough to be able to study the lifespan of a game, you can see that players are not simply sort of static and being an achiever or playing a certain amount of time per day or days per week, that's going to change. And of course, not everybody's going to say, well, that was when the game ended, right? So of course things are different. But lots of games have, histories or, time events that kind of come and go. Servers sometimes will merge. Expansions will happen in a game. And this changes how people play. People go back and forth. And so we really need to take account of that. Related to that, beta periods are incredibly important for shaping the ultimate player community, who's in your beta, how they choose to construct that community, and then carry it forward has incredible implications, just as how games close. And the platforms themselves are also really important. So really what I've done is taken a long time to say it's complicated, and this means good things for game studies, since there are many more games out there to study and more players to investigate, but that we really we can't just rely on sort of these big overarching theories about avatars and player types, because things will come along that really challenge and confound our expectations, and they're important and worthwhile to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia, for the excellent lecture. Now we have a bit time for discussion. Any questions or comments? So may I start actually with a question? Did you ever consider of using avatars yourself in the research as a sort of an anthropological method?
We did play.
Yeah.
Yes, we each had an account, and we spent time within the game. We hatched fauna. We decorated spheres. We zapped pollution. I battled Monty. Monty was kind of fun. But one thing that we didn't do, like I mentioned, we did a survey, we examined the forums, we did in-depth player interviews, but we did not do an extended ethnography within the game.
Hi, thanks for the amazing talk. I would like to ask one question in two different ways, if I may.
Okay.
The first version is that, why did they close the game down? And the second version is that, I'm someone who is interested in user-centered design, and if I get your message right, is that this is one of the companies which is very interested in, establishing this contact to the player base, and doing the beta right, and getting the feedback, and kind of reshaping the structure of the game on the basis of their players' wishes and stuff like that. So, isn't that the recipe for success?
Well, as far as why did the game close, partway through the project, we had originally been involved with, they had a research director who we worked with, and about halfway through she left the company. And after that, they didn't really respond to that was after we had done the survey, so they didn't respond to us. And we sent out some other, feelers as well. So we don't have sort of the inside scoop. I mean, my main assumption is that it was either losing money or it just wasn't making as much money as they wanted it to make. We did have some data from when the game was on Facebook. If you looked at the monthly active and the daily active users, and the monthly active users, which means basically a player logs in at least once in a month. That's monthly active. I think the high was 130,000. Right before the close, it had kind of almost bottomed out. That doesn't take account of people who were logging in via the web. And certainly the people that we talked to, sort of the rabid players, were saying, I spent $100, I spent $200, I spent $1,000. But I think the feeling was with Big Fish that it wasn't the easy money that they thought it would be. MMOs, as you know, require lots of ongoing content, commitment, service. You just can't launch the game and forget it. And what they ended up doing, they had tried it with another small online game. What they've really expanded now into they have their games released for iPad and iPhone, and they've done more and more of that. So I think that was kind of the direction that they went in, that they were trying out a few different ones, to see kind of what was most successful and the easiest to do. And as far as like user-centered design or, like taking care of these communities, like I said, at the end, they really just botched it. And I mean, people were really mad. And remember, this is their original player community. These are people who had been around since beta. They were, players of these casual single-player titles. Many of them said to us, I will never play another Big Fish game again. We don't really know how much that impacted their future success. In contrast, Glitch, which I mentioned, which shut down later, Tiny Speck, the company that made Glitch, handled it totally differently. They had lots of interaction with the players. They put up multiple FAQs about, like a sample question from a player, like, why can't you sell the game to us? Or why can't you create an independent server? Or what do we get out of this? And they created like an art book for the players. I think they had like little plushies that you could buy of your characters. They really sort of went out of their way to sort of say, like, we've tried everything we can. We want to talk to you about this. Here's some things you can have to remember the game. And even though players were disappointed, they felt a lot better about the company.
Yes, actually, I have to start with a confession. I'm totally addicted to Minecraft, this Swedish online game where players can build
I've heard of Minecraft.
Huge kingdoms actually, and castles. But there's a phenomenon called griefing in Minecraft that is quite an issue. So it means that other players are breaking the structures built by players. So they want to intentionally harm those players by breaking those magnificent castles that they have built. And have you encountered that kind of griefing in those games that you have studied?
No. I mean, the most griefing you could find would be the harassment, one player to another. So you could, in public chat, say something. There was no way you could destroy their private sphere. You couldn't alter it in any way. So there was no way you could show up and trash like what they had built. You couldn't steal anything from them. I guess in the public space, you might be able to zap their pollution that they were zapping, and verbally say things, but then that player could just block you and report you. The game Big Fish is very paternalistic, really, in its approach to its players. It was very careful. Like its forums are heavily moderated. They would remove posts that were very critical at all, and they would never have allowed that in the game. So yeah, no, we didn't see anything like that.
Thank you for the presentation, and I wanted to ask you if you have encountered anything about these death and avatars, for example, when an actual player dies and whether players are remembering that avatar and that player in the environment, because I've been researching virtual memorials.
Right.
And in Second Life in World of Warcraft, there's like actual commemorations and funerals for players that have died in the actual life. So have you been encountered anything like that?
Right. We didn't come across anything in Faunasphere about players who had died. And I didn't follow Glitch that closely afterwards, so I don't know if it happened there. You know about, there was that tree that was planted. Raf Koster has talked about it in, it's not EverQuest. It was an earlier game than that. But he's written about, players and how they responded to the death of like another player and how they tried to memorialize it in the game. Okay.
Thank you for that talk. I've got a question before all these questions, because you've explained in a lot of detail about how these games work and what people think of them. But when you think of play, and particularly for children. You know, children have a very specific socially cognitive reason for playing. You know, the world is reduced in miniature for them, and they get to assemble and explore relationships through these characters and objects that they play with. But it's not clear to me what adults are getting out of playing these games. I mean, what are they learning about the world? What are these experiences offering them, if you like, in a way that we conventionally understand play for children, unless you think there is another level of, if you like, social cognition that is operating when adults begin to play games. And if so, what is that?
Okay, good question. Have you read Brian Sutton Smith's The Ambiguities of Play? It's a really good book. He goes through different theories of play historically and tries to kind of pick apart at them, you know, what is the assumption about why we play? And he talks about different themes. You know, we play to role play or to mimic or to learn different things. And, you know, he kind of looks at some of the assumptions that these things are based on. And they're not, some of the theories are specifically about children and learning behaviors, but not all of them are. And so I think that, you know, play is something that culturally we sort of construct and sort of limit to children, and so we think it's sort of weird if adults play, but I think it's something that is something we all do to some extent, even if we feel sort of bad about it. I think that in this game, one of the things that was going on was these players felt it was fun to sort of play with these animals because they could do tricks, you could move them around, you know, they were colorful, they were cute, they made little noises, you know, you could interact with the game space. And so there was, you know, an element of exploration, of discovery, of just sort of playfulness embedded within it that players could experience. And so I think, you know, that was part of it. You know, there was the decorating, there was sort of the leisure aspect, but we tend to approach play with these sort of, you know, laden expectations. And I think we need to do more to understand, like, why adults like to play, and in what ways do we play, and, you know, how could we play differently if most games weren't just about killing and shooting things, you know.
I was just wondering, because they're all very, very childlike, some of these games. I've played Farmville and stuff, right? I get money now. But yes, so there is something definitely happening when adults are participating in this that is very different to what's happening when children are participating in games.
It could be. I honestly don't know because I don't study children, so I couldn't say with certainty what the comparison would be. But, you know, adults play to role play, to make believe, to play what if, to play for excitement, to play for explosions and fun colors as well. They might not tell you that, but.
So thank you for your excellent presentation. You mentioned that some of the player groups, the players you studied, formed these very tight-knit groups that I mentioned that I found all my friends online in this game and so on. So when these people have their experience, their world ending, it's sort of, I find that sort of a spiritual, like a spiritual happening, that it's a sort of eschatonic occurrence when the world goes away and all the friends. Did you pay any attention what happened to these groups of players afterwards? Did they migrate someplace else? Because what I've been thinking when mob games end is that are there these so to say lost tribes of players, and what do they do?
Yeah.
Do they go into other mobs and keep up their culture, sort of refugees there and so on?
Yeah. Celia Pierce wrote a book, Communities of Play, about a group who used to play in Uru. It was an online game based off Myst. That game closed, and the group sort of splintered. Half of them went to Second Life, and half of them went to their.com. And she followed the ones who went into their.com, and sort of how they adapted, you know, and they sort of like saw themselves as virtual refugees. In Faunosphere, a large group created a Facebook group where they would, you know, this was quite ironic since many of them had hated Facebook. This group is still active. People post almost every day Some of them are still like digging up old screenshots or talking about how much they miss the game, or here's a video that I found of gameplay, that kind of thing. As I mentioned, some of them did go into Glitch, which was one online game. Some of them tried some other social games. But the thing was that they found, they actually, before the forums disappeared, they had threads going where they sent out sort of expedition parties to different games to say, like, where's another game that we can go? But the problem was that Faunasphere was so different from other types of games that there was really nothing that quite matched.
So Consalvo is a lost Eden then?
Yeah, they totally did, and they'll tell you that.
Contact these people to you. Is it possible to make contact with these people?
Oh yeah, I'm still in contact with them.
I'm going to see you later because I want to meet them.
Okay. Some of them have gotten together in person. You know, they've gotten together in groups, but mostly they still like post on their Facebook group.
I'd like to ask about the stereotypicality of the various scripts that are being performed here. So you talk about norms of games that emerge and are discussed and reacted to. And I understand that playing styles would be like the different persona, online persona that we play online. So an avatar would also have different kinds of persona, perhaps virtual persona, and the relationship could be more complicated. But in terms of ritual, are the scripts here, I could see you had two different scripts that were in conflict, which were rather stereotyped. So the Facebook script that they were used to, and the script that was had developed or been constructed in this community. Is it so that if you study the forum discussions that people react heavily to when you break the stereotypicality or the script, the ritual that has been constructed, and how stereotyped are these scripts? How stereotyped are the rituals? Do people like when we have very easily recognized scripts that we play?
Good questions. I think that to some extent these are sort of, I've exaggerated them a little bit here. There are certainly, as I mentioned, some people who said, I don't see a problem with people from Facebook. They're perfectly nice to me. Or some people who said, I'm a Facebook player. I think I'm okay. Don't hate me. And some beta players who said, I still greet people and help them out. I think that part of what was interesting about the beta community and that beta period is it sets this tone, and it almost doesn't matter what really happened. It's the stories that you tell about what happened and sort of the community memories, the common memories that get generated and taken forth. And those just naturally sort of become stereotypical, mythological. They're gonna lose some of that specificity as a way to say, back in the good old days, in beta when everything was sunny and people helped each other and they were giving eggs, and and that's just a way that the community is sort of trying to draw a boundary around itself to say that this is the way that we are. This is our past and the way that we should be. And of course, on a daily basis, they're going to negotiate more complexly, but that, like at least in their memories and their constructions, they did tend to fall back on those to some extent.
I was most fascinated about hearing how the adults acted negatively to the children or the younger coming to the game. And for me, it's a bit the same. I like to play with my girlfriend, and we are worms or something. But I don't like so much to play with children. Mm-hmm. And have there been studies about this? About how different is the game?
Actually, this is one thing that I think is actually fairly common among multiplayer games, in that if you see poor behavior and you ask players about poor behavior, what will they typically say? Oh, that's just some 14-year-old boy, right? That it's some child, some adolescent who doesn't know how to behave, they're just some rude teenager, and that we sort of ascribe this, youth and a set of behaviors, to this one kind of identity. And so in that sense, the players of Faunasphere were really no different than how like people in World of Warcraft will react to, instances of trolling or griefing or that kind of thing. Sometimes, I think I had maybe one or two examples, players would say, this person I was interacting with, they were a child, like obviously I could tell by the way, they didn't understand certain concepts, or, they told them, or, or something like that, and so they felt like these people can't even understand the concepts of what they should be doing. But that much more than that, it was just sort of this cultural construction of the poor player as the rude child. And I haven't really seen anybody talk about it in depth very much, and I think it's something that really does need attention because it is so common. It does keep cropping up everywhere, the poor player. Why is the poor player always that 14-year-old boy? Why? When really, it could be a 60-year-old woman.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is interesting because it connects a lot also to previous studies about internet communities. Were you able to see groups within the group, so to say? Were you able to see hierarchies and structures? Were some people taking the lead, becoming leaders that draw on, that form particular ways of talking or polarizations within the group? And who were these people?
Right. We didn't really go that closely within the groups to see kind of how they were referring to each other and who might be a leader or those types of things. Partly that wasn't what we were looking at early on, partly everything disappeared, like I said, from the forums, so there wasn't that material to rely back on. But it would be interesting to do that kind of microanalysis to see, within the group, who becomes a leader and why. And I think Celia Pierce's study, she might do some of that with her study, because she did in-depth ethnography with this group over a period of several years, so she might have more to say on how a leader emerged, or why, and that kind of thing.
Hello, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. It's wonderful to see someone who's actually played the game who is studying a game. I get in the circles where I go too often people who have never even played the game telling us things about the games, which any player would tell them directly, no, well, that's not true. So, yeah. So thank you for that. My question is, you said that different cultures, Facebook culture versus the local beta culture. I played certain online games myself, and I've noticed that on different types of servers, for example, different types of cultures emerge. So, for example, on a PvP server, the griefing would be, at least on some servers, would be the norm. Whereas on a role-playing server, the kind of friendly attitude would be the norm. Have you looked into that? Do you know if somebody has?
That reminded me, Holland Lynn, she's studied World of Warcraft. She's done comparative studies of Chinese and I think Hong Kong players. And what she looked at was, WoW is available in China, but the expansions, when they come out in the West, they take much longer to get to China because China has to approve them, and it just takes far too long. What a lot of the players do in China, the more dedicated ones, is when the expansion becomes available in Hong Kong, they jump over to a Hong Kong server so that they can play that content. And what she was doing was studying the Hong Kong servers over a period of several years, looking at sort of the influx, because these Chinese players would show up, play for a while, but then when the expansion came out in China, they'd go back. And she looked at over a period of years, at first there was a small group of Chinese players, and then it gradually increased over time, and it really sort of changed how the players interacted with one another. Because at first, the Chinese players, it was a very small group, they knew they were in the minority, they were sort of we have to be on our best behavior because we're, this small group. But as the group grew, they suddenly started taking more ownership, hey, there are lots of us, we don't have to, put up with anti-Chinese sentiments, we can do what we want. And so she's done some good studies of how the player community was sort of responding and adapting to these changes in the composition of the group. And so I think that might be really interesting. Holland Lin, L-I-N.
Any more questions? Now it seems that we have running out of hands. Any more questions? Okay, I suggest that we once more thank Mia Consalvo for the excellent lecture.